So thank you very much, John and Linda, for this invitation to come to speak here in Boston. And of course, thanks to all of you for sticking around. It's a pleasure to be here in Boston, to attend this workshop, and to have some time to meet with some old friends and with some new ones. So today, I'd like to give some attention to a case study of how ancient Egyptian literature interacts with some broader cultural and intellectual issues far beyond Egyptology or the study of antiquity, with specific reference to the first tale of Setnakamwas and its African-American reception. Now, strictly speaking, this isn't about blacks in the Bible so much as it is about how some African-Americans have interpreted a specific manifestation of ancient Egyptian culture in the context of the biblical narrative of the Moses legend, and conversely, how they've interpreted the Moses legend in terms of ancient Egypt. Now, I should add that I'm an Egyptologist. I'm not a scholar of the Bible or of African-American culture, so I approach this subject from a very specific and particular angle, which is certainly not the only one possible. My immediate goal here today is to present to you some interesting material and to tell you what I've made of it over the years, but also I hope to learn something from you about what all of this might mean. Now, the ancient Egyptian story I'm talking about today, the first tale of Setnakamwas, is something I've been working on for a long, long time, really since I first read it as a graduate student, probably back in 1993 or so. Earlier this semester, I finally finished a book on this subject, or to be more precise, I finally got my manuscript to the point where I could submit it to the publisher. I expect there'll be some more tweaks and adjustments, and I hope that this discussion we can have here today will help me improve this aspect of my book. In fact, my real point in bringing this up is to point out that while I'm, of course, interested in the story as a great work of Egyptian belles lettres, over the years I've come to realize that Setna I, which is what I'll call it, is particularly important for its modern reception and its cultural impact. Now, I've spoken about this at many Egyptological venues, and there are certainly those who, hearing me talk about this yet again, might accuse me of beating a dead horse. Dead horse gif up there. But there really is no ancient Egyptian fictional narrative text that has affected the intellectual and cultural world outside of Egyptology more than Setna I. In fact, nothing else really comes close. But I know that Demotic literature, that is literature that comes from the later period of ancient Egyptian history, written in a special cursive script called Demotic, is not always as familiar to audiences as I wish it would be. So before I go much further, let me give you some general background on the story. Now, this is an image of the first two columns of the Demotic manuscript of the story. This manuscript was completed in the 3rd century BCE, which is quite late by the standards of ancient Egyptian history. It's been part of the Egyptian National Collection in Cairo since it was first discovered in 1867. Setna I is the earliest discovered of a number of tales featuring a character named Setnakamwas, who is the fictional persona of a historic Kamwas, one of the most important sons of Ramses II. Now, there's one other tale, the predictably named second tale of Setnakamwas, which is largely intact. But there are a number of fragmentary stories that are connected to this character as well. Kamwas was one of Ramses II's oldest sons, probably even before Ramses became king. There is evidence that Kamwas was, for a time, Ramses II's crown prince, but he died several years before his father, who, as many of you may know, probably lived well into his 90s. Kamwas's main professional attainment was that of high priest of the god Ptah in Memphis. In this capacity, he carried the title Sem, a very common religious title. Now, the ancient Egyptian language existed for a long time. There were many changes in the pronunciation of words over the thousands of years in which the language was spoken and written. One of the changes is the fact that the priestly title Sem over time developed an intrusive consonant T. So it's often spelled as Setem in the late New Kingdom and later. Phonetic and orthographic changes in the Ptolemaic period resulted in the further developments of Seton and Setna, which is how the title is spelled in our manuscripts. In the tales, this title is actually treated as a personal name, or at least it's the way in which the character is most often addressed. However, the tales use the full form Setnakamwas more than once and connect him directly to a pharaoh, Usar Mara, that is the throne name of Ramses II. So the identity of the fictional Setna Kamwas and the historical Kamwas is not in any doubt. Now, First Setna is a ghost story with both an undead mummy and a supernatural seductress who lures the hero of the tale into a terrifying trap. Somewhat unusually, the columns of the existing manuscript are numbered, and the first existing column is numbered 3. So we know that there are 2 missing columns. We'll hope they still exist somewhere. The missing beginning of the tale cannot be reconstructed in detail, but the logic of the story and the tale's frequent use of parallelisms and mirroring between events and characters make it possible to offer a few hopefully plausible conjectures. We can assume that as the tale commences, Setna learns of the existence of the magic book of Thoth that is located in one of the necropolises of Memphis, south of modern Cairo, presumably Saqqara. One way or another, Setna learns that the magic book is supposed to be in the tomb of a certain Naneferkaptah, whose name you can see up here on the screen. In life, a prince and magician like himself, but unlike Setna, to all appearances, an entirely fictional character. It's protected in a series of 6 nested caskets, made respectively of iron, copper, juniper wood, ebony and ivory, silver, and gold. It may be the case, or it may not be, that the text means to imply that Naneferkaptah had lived about 7 generations, about a century and a half before Setna. But beyond the fact that Naneferkaptah had lived a long time before Setna, the specifics of their chronological relationship are not obviously important to the story. Setna locates the tomb, breaks in with the help of his foster brother named Eneros, and attempts to steal the book. But he's interrupted by the ghost of Naneferkaptah's sister and wife, Ikhweret, who is in the tomb along with the ghost of the couple's son named Merib-Ptah. We learn later that these ghosts are in the tomb thanks to, quote, the craft of a good scribe, that is, magic, effected by Naneferkaptah. At some point in column 2, Ikhweret hopes to dissuade Setna from taking the book from the tomb and begins to recount for Setna her life with her brother, Naneferkaptah, the birth of their child, Merib-Ptah, and the disastrous search for the book of Thoth. As preserved, the papyrus begins on column 3 with Ikhweret's lengthy embedded narrative already underway, and her story within a story continues on for the first 66 lines of the manuscript, that is, through the line 25 of column 4. Ikhweret's tale must have begun with her and Naneferkaptah as young sister and brother, the only children of a pharaoh named Mernebptah. At some point, the two realize that each desires to marry the other. All we know for certain, however, is that it is Ikhweret, not Naneferkaptah, who sends a servant to their father to propose the marriage. As the preserved portion of the tale begins in earnest, we learn that Ikhweret is excited and happy about the prospect of marrying her brother, and though her father for some reason had been opposed to the idea, Ikhweret is able to cajole him into permitting it. She describes her wedding celebration, the birth of her son Merib-Ptah, and then the fateful day on which an old priest had approached her brother Naneferkaptah and tempted him to mount his quest for the magic book of Thoth. Ikhweret describes this quest for Setna, beginning with a river voyage to distant Koptos, which is modern Kift, about 600 kilometers south of Memphis. It's close to Luxor, modern ancient Thebes, near the place where this book had been hidden by Thoth. We learn that the book is hidden in its series of 6 nested caskets. Ikhweret describes Naneferkaptah's combat against a monster, an eternal snake that had guarded the book. She describes the effects of the book, and then she recounts how Merib-Ptah, and then she herself, and finally Naneferkaptah had all died by decree of the angry gods. But the deaths of the family were not the worst of it. Ikhweret and Merib-Ptah are, at this moment, spiritually present in Naneferkaptah's Memphite tomb, but their mortal remains are actually buried near the site of their deaths at Koptos, and so the family must endure eternal separation. And as her tale concludes, Ikhweret pleads with Setna to leave the book in peace, since her entire family had given their lives for it. But Setna will not be put off, and following a slapstick encounter with the living mummy of Naneferkaptah himself, he succeeds in taking the book from the tomb. Now, Setna at first believes he has gotten away scot-free, but soon he has a terrifying encounter with the mysterious and irresistible Tabubu. With Setna helplessly infatuated, Tabubu imposes a series of increasingly alarming conditions for the promise of her sexual favors, conditions that culminate in her demand for the murder of Setna's own children. Setna agrees, but fortunately the entire experience, including the deaths of the children, turns out to have been an illusion, contrived by Naneferkaptah and Ikweret, of whom Tabubu is probably some sort of a manifestation, to motivate Setna to return the book. Relieved to learn that his children are still alive, Setna concludes, upon the urgent advice of his father Ramses II, that returning the book is now the wise thing to do. Back in Naneferkaptah's tomb, Setna asks Naneferkaptah what he might do to make amends. Naneferkaptah asks that Setna travel to Koptos to bring the mummies of Ikweret and Meriptah to Memphis for reburial with Naneferkaptah. Setna agrees, and the reader gets the distinct impression that the entire convoluted train of events had been orchestrated by Naneferkaptah with exactly this resolution in mind. Following the reburial, the site of the tomb is magically concealed with some sort of a mystical cloud to permanently guard the family and the book against future rediscovery. This appears to have worked as intended. Well, as you can gather from this summary of First Setna, Setna Kamwaz is, in his legendary persona, a magician. And in First Setna, he's particularly interested in the discovery of ancient texts. These aspects of these aspects of the historic Kamwaz career can be traced back to antiquity. Kamwaz, the historic Kamwaz, has often been characterized as the first Egyptologist, and if this is somewhat exaggerated, it is true that Kamwaz in his lifetime was unusually active and clearly personally invested in restoring numerous Old Kingdom monuments in the Memphite area. From his perspective, already more than 1,000 years old, as many restoration inscriptions naming him attest. This is a famous example, an inscription on the exterior of the Pyramid of Unas at Saqqara from the late 5th dynasty in Egypt, or around 2350 BC. Now, as High Priest of Ptah, the historic Kamwaz was also closely connected to the cult of the Apis, the living bull that was considered a sort of avatar of Ptah, and who, in death, was assimilated to Osiris in the form of Osiris Apis, or in its Greek guide, Serapis. Kamwaz appears to have supervised the construction of an extensive new temple and underground galleries at Saqqara for the burial of Apis mummies, and his close connection to the Apis cult and to the construction of the Saqqara Serapeum, that is the catacombs of Osiris Apis, has led to the occasional claim that he was actually buried there. Now, this is a controversial claim, has been ever since an alleged mummy of Kamwaz was discovered in a chamber of the Serapeum in 1852 by Auguste Mariette, a great early Egyptologist who you see right there. What Mariette actually found was a mummy that was more or less human in size and in shape, equipped with a golden mask, which you see here, and a great deal of gold jewelry and other objects mentioning the name of Kamwaz, but which actually was just a mass of bitumen and fragmentary bone fragments. Here's how Mariette described it, using the name Shah-im-Jam, which is an earlier incorrect interpretation of the writing of the name Kamwaz. This is Mariette. Picture a mummy in human form, destroyed from the chest down. A thick gold mask, today in the Louvre, covered the face. About the neck were hung 2 chains, also of gold, from one of which 3 amulets were suspended. As to the interior, it presented only a mass of odorous bitumen mixed with formless bone fragments, in the midst of which were found 2 or 3 pieces of gold cloisonné jewelry inlaid with glass plaques. Finally, next to this singular historic object, I discovered a large scarab of grayish steatite, a small column of green feldspar, and about 20 human-shaped funerary statuettes. Voila, our Apis. And one can imagine the extent of the dilemma in which this discovery inevitably placed us when it was realized that, while all of the artifacts found on the mummy carried nothing other than the title and name of Shah-im-Jam, that's Kamwaz, everything found in the vicinity mentioned the name and customary epithets of Osirapis, that is, the deceased Apis. Is it an Apis? Is it the mummy of Shah-im-Jam? I hesitate to take a position. Unfortunately, the mummy itself has long since disappeared. It's probably the case that Mariette just threw it away, as he did with much of the bone debris that he excavated at the Serapeum. We'll probably never really know whether this mummy was that of Kamwaz, unless a definite tomb of Kamwaz is ever discovered at some other location. A likely spot might be an unusual chapel of Kamwaz that a Japanese team has been excavating in northwest Saqqara since the 1990s. But so far, this monument does not seem to include a tomb for Kamwaz. But in any case, Kamwa's legend developed over time and also came to be connected to the idea of searching for hidden knowledge in ancient texts. For example, the prologue of a version of the Book of the Dead, chapter 167, which is preserved in manuscripts now in Leiden and in Paris, claims that the chapter had been discovered by Kamwas himself, written on a jar that had been placed under the head of a mummy in the Memphite necropolis. Now, the manuscript of First Setna was purchased for the Egyptian National Collection by Mariette, probably sometime in 1860, maybe early 1861, although the exact date is a little vague. The circumstance of the discovery of the papyrus were subject to elaborate and mutually contradictory rumors from the beginning, with the most widely circulated and extremely improbable tale being that the papyrus was discovered in the tomb of a Coptic monk in a box with a collection of hieratic, Demotic, and Coptic papyri. All we know for certain is that in 1865, Mariette turned the papyrus over for study to Heinrich Brugsch, who was the first really proficient Demotic scholar in the history of Egyptology. By 1867, Brugsch had deciphered the story and published it in a French journal called the Revue Archéologique. Of course, Brugsch had made some mistakes, and there are some aspects of the tale which even today are not perfectly understood, but his decipherment was a great achievement, and certainly he understood the story in its broad outlines and in most of its details. Now, the lurid and occasionally sexually explicit nature of the story was to ensure that almost from the moment of its publication, it would attract the attention of non-Egyptologists. Now, that's not to say that the tale was ever widely known beyond a smaller circle of Egyptologists and well-informed Egyptophiles, but among the earliest readers of our tale were a number of writers, some of whom were and remain widely read and even influential. Aspects of the tale were adapted in historical fiction like that of Thomas Mann's 1936 Joseph in Egypten and in Mika Walteri's 1945 Sinaway the Egyptian, or in Gothic horror and fantasy fiction like the 1918 Sax Rohmer novel Brood of the Witch Queen, which itself directly inspired the 1932 Universal Studios film The Mummy. Okay? All of this can be traced back to the first tale of Setna Kamwas. The character Tabubu particularly attracted attention with a short novel entitled Tabubu. It's really just a paraphrase of the Demotic tale, published in 1894 by the Belgian brothers Joseph and Seraphine Beu. Though largely forgotten today, the Beu brothers were well known in the 1890s as pioneers of science and fantasy fiction, collaborated under the name J.H. Rosny. The one Rosny novel that is still somewhat well known today is called La Guerre du Feu, the War of Fire, which was published in English in the 1960s as The Quest for Fire, and was made into an Academy Award-winning film in the 1980s. Now, the Rosny Tabubu is not a particularly great piece of writing, but it was beautifully illustrated, both in its 1894 edition by a Czech artist named Ludek Marold and a partner who worked under the pseudonym Mitas. I have not been able to find any information about Mitas or a photograph or any information at all about this person, although there's quite a bit of work by Mitas in a lot of late 19th century French illustrated books. And then in a reedition in 1932 by a very talented but largely forgotten French illustrator named Maurice Lalo. Now, but before I get to my main subject, which is the African-American reception of the first tale of Setna Kamwas, I want to go through some of these illustrations because they're quite striking and not often seen. Mitas, again, I've not been able to identify this person, contributed a number of generic images of Egyptian divinities and locations, among them these. But the illustrations connected to the tale itself were skillfully done by Marold in a conventional but often racy neoclassical style, as you can see here in this bust of Tabubu, which is the book's frontispiece. Now, Marold obviously did some significant amount of research for his images. His Tabubu seems to be based on late 19th century images of Cleopatra. For comparison, here's a detail from an image of Cleopatra in a famous painting by Lawrence Alma Tadema from a few years earlier. The face is basically that of Cleopatra's ancestor Ptolemy I, as you can see here from this coin portrait. Marold's Tabubu shares with this Cleopatra the same aquiline nose, back-swept hair with a diadem, characteristically bulbous chin, although Merrill has made his tabubu a little prettier by toning her chin down somewhat. Another very attractive is tabubu on the dromos, or ceremonial avenue of the Temple of Ptah in Memphis. Notice here she's strolling along next to a small sphinx. The inspiration for this might have been the then recent discovery by Auguste Mariette of an avenue of sphinxes at the Saqqara Serapeum. But the image is also extremely similar to a monument to Mariette himself, which had been constructed in 1882 in Mariette's hometown of Boulogne-sur-Mer in France. Here also Mariette, perched on the top of his own pyramid, has his hand resting on a thigh-high Egyptianizing head. Merrill even seems to have snuck himself into the illustrations. As you can see here, if you compare Setna here on the left, sporting a very un-Egyptian-looking Van Dyck, reclining naked in Tabubu's salon while being served a glass of wine by a similarly unclad servant girl, with the self-portrait of Merrill in his studio, which had been done 2 years earlier in 1892. But the whole reason for publishing the book, entitling it Tabubu, was to exploit the unveiling scene, in which the story itself says this: Tabubu arose, and she put on a dress of royal linen, through which Setna could see every part of her body, which is what Merrill is illustrating right here. Now, when the Rosny Tabubu was first published, it came out in a modest, small volume, priced at only 2 French francs. Today, you can buy a first edition from antiquarian booksellers for about €100 or less. In fact, I have a copy. That's where my scans came from. But the 1932 re-edition by Maurice Lalo is a very different kettle of fish. It can go today for upwards of €7,000. I do not own a copy of this one. The book is rare, with only 110 copies ever printed, essentially by hand, with gold-embellished plates done with a stenciling technique called pochoir, which was widely used in fine press book production in the French Art Deco period. Now, for the sake of time, I'll just go through a couple of these. The first is the image that was used in this beautiful poster, or the earlier poster that had been designed. It shows Tabubu and her entourage of servant girls, with Setna turning his head to catch a glimpse of them. And here's the detail of the scene, which, I think, even in this scan, the gold details, real gold details, just kind of pop in her hair, in her clothing, and in the leaves of the tree. The other really striking image is that of Tabubu watching placidly while Setna's children are killed. Now, Tabubu's nudity here is a complete invention of the artist, probably modeled on Orientalist odalisque paintings like this one on the right, Pharaoh's Favorite, a fairly often reproduced image by an artist named Vlaho Bukovac. So with all that, I hope I've convinced you that the first tale of Setna Kamwaz, particularly in the late 19th century and earlier 20th century, had a very extensive impact on popular culture, in literature, the visual arts, and even film. But now, finally, I can turn to my main subject, the African-American reception of Setna I, and the place of the tale in the broader African-American reception of ancient Egypt, which hasn't really been investigated very much. But there is a lot of material to go through, and it's of considerable interest. Now, African-American interest in Egypt has roots in many of the same historical circumstances that gave rise to the general Victorian and Edwardian Egyptomania that is often discussed. But as the African-American cultural historian Wilson Moses, in his book Afrotopia, The Roots of African-American Popular History, explains, Egypt had special resonance for African-Americans in the years during which Egyptology was crystallizing, although in 2 somewhat contradictory ways. On the one hand, enslaved African Americans had long been accustomed to reading the story of Hebrew bondage in Egypt as an allegory of their own oppression. And in this constellation, Egypt and Pharaoh were hardly positive images. One of the most familiar examples of this is the Negro spiritual Go Down Moses, originally published in 1862 as Oh Let My People Go. On the other hand, the systematic exploration of ancient Egypt in the 19th century was bringing to light an indisputable example of a high civilization in Africa, one that was impressive and fascinating to the entire world. There is no doubt that the results of 19th century Egyptology reached the attention of African Americans, particularly free African Americans in non-slave states, and piqued their interest as it piqued the interest of people everywhere. Less than a decade after Champollion's decipherment of the hieroglyphic script, there had emerged voices like that of the American freedman David Walker, who in 1829 strongly stressed the Africanness of the ancient Egyptians and who argued that the Egyptians had been far more humane to their Hebrew slaves than contemporary white Americans were to their black slaves. And as Pan-Africanism and Afrocentrism emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries as political and cultural positions, it was logical and inevitable that many African Americans would adopt what Wilson Moses called a specifically Egyptocentric stance, the view that if black Americans could only understand themselves in relation to Africa, then they should not hesitate to claim for themselves the legacy of Egypt, which had been the apex of African culture and history. Now, of course, it sometimes happens in modern discussions of Egypt that white Egyptologists will dismiss claims of this sort as emotional and misplaced, to say the least. But of course, when they do, they forget their own disciplinary history, which has also included attempts by white Egyptological luminaries to lay claim to ancient Egypt on the grounds of racial kinship. A great example of this was James Breasted, founder of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, who famously or infamously claimed in his 1926 high school history text, The Conquest of Civilizations, that the ancient Egyptians had been part of the, quote, great white race, notwithstanding their, quote, tanned skins. But so far, the earliest specifically African-American reflex of Setna I or Setna I that I've been able to find was Zora Neale Hurston's 1939 novel, Moses, Man of the Mountain, which extensively adapts First Setna. Now, I think most people here know that Zora Hurston was a major figure of the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s and 1930s. She was primarily a novelist, but she had substantial anthropological training. She earned a BA in anthropology from Barnard College, the women's undergraduate college affiliated with Columbia University. After Barnard, Hurston went on to do graduate work in anthropology at Columbia, where she studied with Franz Boas. Aside from her fiction, she also wrote nonfiction on black folklore and folkways, particularly voodoo, which she studied in the field in Haiti, Jamaica, and Louisiana. Now, as Susan Meisenhelder, a professor of English at Cal State San Bernardino, pointed out already back in 1999, and I hate it when I guess we all hate it when we find something and then discover that someone else figured it out 10 years before we did. So I did figure out the connection here between Moses, Man of the Mountain, and Setna Kamwas on my own, but then in looking around, I discovered that Professor Meisenhelder had figured it out in 1999, so I must give her credit for priority. Hurston apparently became aware of Setna I via the English translation that had appeared in the 1895 anthology of Egyptian literature that had been brought out by the great British Egyptologist Flinders Petrie. In a number of places, she adapts Petrie's version practically verbatim, as you can see in this slide. But in reworking Setna I, Hurston introduced two fundamental modifications to the basic plot of the Egyptian tale. First, Hurston replaced the character Naneferkaptah with Moses, now himself the Egyptian who journeys to Koptos in search of the magic book of Thoth, and not for his own selfish purposes, but to use the power of the book to prepare himself for his prophetic mission. Secondly, Man of the Mountain lacks a Tabubu-like character. Unlike most other Setna I adapters, the sexual aspects of the tale do not seem to have interested Hurston at all. The focus of the novel is squarely on the quest for the magic book of Thoth and on the mystical knowledge that the book contains. Now, I suspect that Man of the Mountain lacks a femme fatale, mostly because the Setna Tabubu encounter had been basically expurgated from Hurston's source material in Petrie's anthology. Petrie was writing for a lay audience in the late Victorian period, and so he had dared only to summarize the Tabubu encounter in his version of the tale, remarking that it was, quote, not creditable to Egyptian society. But it is also true that Man of the Mountain, Moses' appropriation of the Book of Thoth, is not opposed by the gods, and so there was no need for Hurston to introduce a punishing character to force Moses to abandon the book. But in any case, Hurston handles the mystical aspects of the tale in a way that is not paralleled by any of the European authors who adapted the story. The earliest Setna adapters had mostly read the tale through the conventions of the Victorian Gothic. Others, like Mann and Valtteri, had worked within an academic Egyptological conception of ancient Egyptian culture history. Hurston, in contrast, reinterpreted Setna I in the context of African American and Afro-Caribbean mysticism, specifically voodoo. Now, while studying voodoo in the Caribbean, Hurston had recorded folk traditions that identified Moses with Dambalawedo, among the most important voodoo loa, or gods, for whom the snake was a particularly powerful symbol, so much so that Dambala is frequently identified with St. Patrick. Finding in Setna 1 a striking tale of Egyptian magicians, particularly a tale in which a magic protective snake figures so prominently, clearly made Hurston ponder the possibility of a link between Setna 1 and the Moses Dambalawedo tradition of the Caribbean. This and cognate traditions, she thought, must predate the Bible and must link disparate folk memories that had their origins throughout Africa and Western Asia. As she wrote in Tell My Horse, her 1938 non-fiction account of voodoo, quote, "This worship of Moses recalls the hard-to-explain fact that wherever the Negro is found, there are traditional tales of Moses and his supernatural powers that are not in the Bible, nor can they be found in any written life of Moses. The rod of Moses is said to have been a subtle serpent, and hence came his great powers. All over the southern United States, the British West Indies, and Haiti, there are irreverent tales of Moses and his magic. It is hardly possible that it's hardly possible that all of them sprang up, coming in contact with Christianity after coming to the Americas. It is, oh, thank you so much. That sort of reminds me of a great scene in The Devil's Advocate. Do you guys remember this, where the voodoo priest prevents this guy from testifying in court by forcing him to cough, by banging nails through the tongue of a cow or something like that? I hope I have not offended the Loa. So all over the southern United States, the British West Indies, and Haiti, there are reverent tales of Moses and his magic. I think I said that. Okay. Now, Man of the Mountain was not Hurston's most successful novel, and she was later to admit a certain disappointment in it, but the strong underlying story had its undeniable appeal. In 1948, a paraphrase of Hurston's tale of Moses and his quest for the magic book of Thoth was included in a short book called Mystery of the Long-Lost 8th, 9th, and 10th Books of Moses, together with the legend that was of Moses and 44 secret keys to universal power, by an author of Afrocentric mystical and occult literature who wrote under the pseudonym Henri Gamache. Apparently his real name was Henry Marsh, as indicated in this Library of Congress copyright entry. But beyond this, the real man behind the pseudonym seems lost to history. Gamache seems to have wanted to create the impression that this tale was actually an authentic, ancient, but hitherto unknown tradition regarding the life of Moses, or at any rate to leave the matter hanging. He writes, basically paraphrasing Hurston. Then one day he, that's Moses, heard a strange tale from an ancient stable hand. It was the legend of a book which Thoth himself was said to have written with his own hand, a book which, when read, would bring all knowledge and power to the finder. And the book was said to be in Coptos, buried in the middle of the river, guarded by a deathless snake. It was then that Moses determined to seek it out. When he came to Coptos, he went straight to the temple of Isis and made an offering to her, and he sank a shaft into the water in the middle of the river and descended there to seek the box in which the book was said to rest. And he found it wrapped with scorpions and snakes, which he caused to lie as if asleep. Then he met the guardian of the box, the deathless snake, and for 3 days he fought until the snake gave no further resistance. Now, Gamache includes a short bibliography in his book's front matter, and this bibliography does include Moses, Man of the Mountain, but nowhere in his text does he explicitly credit Hurston for this specific story, and nor does he appear to have had any information on the underlying first tale of Setna Kamwas. But a far more interesting use of this material was to come 33 years later, or 33 years after Hurston's Moses novel, in the 1972 novel Mumbo Jumbo by Ishmael Reed. And again, I don't need to probably introduce Ishmael Reed to this audience, but for those who haven't read him, his writing is often compared to the ironic freeform fiction of Kurt Vonnegut, although in an interview of Reed that I recently found, he mentions that he strongly dislikes this comparison. But in any case, Reed is among the most highly regarded American writers of the second half of the 20th century. You may know he won a MacArthur Foundation Genius Fellowship in 1998. Now, Mumbo Jumbo is, on the surface and in part, a parody of hard-boiled detective novels, with clear echoes of Dashiell Hammett's 1930, The Maltese Falcon. In Mumbo Jumbo, various characters living in New York City's Harlem neighborhoods during the 1920s mount competing searches for the Book of Thoth, which is described as a mysterious hidden document that has lately caused an outbreak of Jess Grew, as you can see if you'll quickly scan these short extracts. Now, for its part, Jess Grew is a communicable mass ecstasy that has recently taken hold of black populations of the United States, causing dancing, fainting, and speaking in tongues to spread uncontrollably. Jess Grew appears to have its own form of consciousness, or at least some sort of inner direction, and since antiquity, it has continually attempted to be united, quote, with its, quote, text, the Book of Thoth, erupting whenever it feels itself near its goal. And if Jess Grew succeeds in its quest for unity with the Book of Thoth, it will finally be realized in the reestablishment of the true African Osirian religion, which would represent universal freedom. But from the beginning, Jess Grew has been fought at every step, first by the Aten worshippers of Akhenaten's Egypt, and then by their spiritual descendants, Knights Templar, Freemasons, and even the American government. The U.S. Invasion of Haiti in 1915 is explained in the novel as an attempt to stamp out an outbreak of Jess Grew there. And in the novel's present, it is black Muslims who oppose Jess Grew. Now, these groups may seem superficially disparate and even mutually antagonistic, but they are nevertheless all united in their commitment to the spiritual and political regimentation of a stringent worldwide monotheism. Now, in the story within a story that explains the origin of the Book of Thoth, the novel's hero, the voodoo priest Papa Laba, recounts a tale that Reed had adapted from Moses' Man of the Mountain. Laba explains that the book had been first discovered by Moses in the temple of Isis in Coptos after Moses had learned of its existence from his Midianite father-in-law, Jethro. Well, Moses and his wife Zipporah were about to leave because he wanted as quickly as possible to return to Egypt to show off, quote, my lovely black bride to my stepmother, the Pharaoh, and my high yellow sisters and brothers. Yes. One day when you return, Jethro said, you can take a trip to Coptos where there is in existence the sacred book said to have been written by Thoth himself. What? Moses asked. I said, one of these days Isis will show you the real Book of Thoth, the original sound, the one located in her temple at Coptos, guarded by the deathless snake. It has to be gotten during the right moon, or it will be the book in its evil phase. Unfortunately, Moses was indeed to obtain the book during the wrong lunar phase, and so it was never to confer the fullness of its power upon humanity. But in any case, in the novel's climax, Laba and his confederates, Black Herman and Team Malice, prepare to open a series of nested caskets in which the Book of Thoth is supposed to be hidden. The caskets are discovered beneath Harlem's Cotton Club, and their description corresponds closely to the nested caskets and the magical creatures guarding the book in Set No. 1. Quote from the novel, go get the book, T. T. Malice goes out to his car and returns with a huge gleaming box covered with snakes and scorpions shaped of sparkling gems. The ladies then take their breath at such a gorgeous display. On top can be seen the Knights Templar seal, 2 knights riding Biesa, the Templar's piebald horse. T. Malice places the book down in the center of the floor, removes the first box, an iron box. The second box, which is bronze and shines so that they have to turn the ceiling lights down. And then this box is a sycamore box, and under the sycamore, ebony, and under this ivory, and then silver, and finally gold, and then empty. It turns out that the book had already been destroyed by Abdul Sufi Hamid, a black Muslim who had gotten hold of the book, managed to translate it, and then burned it when he realized its, quote, lewd, nasty, and decadent nature. Now, it was noted by reviewers soon after the publication of Mumbo Jumbo that its quest for the Book of Thoth depends on Hurston's Moses, Man of the Mountain. And Reed also knew Henri Gamache's long-lost 8th, 9th, and 10th books of Moses, and he references it in his novel. However, as far as I've been able to determine, it's never before been pointed out, and certainly not investigated in detail, that the ultimate source of Mumbo Jumbo's Book of Thoth is the first tale of Set Nakamwaz. And I actually emailed Ishmael Reed about this a couple of years ago, and he confirmed to me that he himself was unaware of the specific ancient Egyptian origins of this tale. Now, Reed's Mumbo Jumbo has garnered a great deal of analysis, with a particularly interesting discussion by Henry Louis Gates, the great professor of English literature, down which way? That way, down the road at Harvard University, with particular interest, of course, in African American literature. And Gates discussed mumbo jumbo at some length in his 1988 The Signifying Monkey, a theory of African American literary criticism. But Gates' discussion was hampered by the fact that he apparently had no idea of the actual Egyptian origins of the Magic Book of Thoth and mumbo jumbo, any more than Reed did. And to explain the Egyptian material in mumbo jumbo, and in particular the novel's emphasis on writing and on the relationship of Thoth to Egyptian magic and mysticism, Gates instead offered the theory that Reed had drawn on Plato's dialogue, the Phaedros, which includes what Plato presents as an Egyptian myth explaining the origin of writing, as a gift of Thoth to the Egyptians through a divine king, Thamus, additionally identified with Amun himself. A gift with both potential benefits, but also with substantial potential harms. Quote from Gates. Reed's use of the myth of Thoth is, of course, not accidental or arbitrary. He repeats and inverts Plato's dialogue, salient point for salient point, even down to Socrates' discourse on the excesses of the dance, which is the theme of mumbo jumbo. It is not too much to say that mumbo jumbo is one grand signifying riff on the Phaedrus, parodying it through the hidden polemic. Now, I won't say there's nothing to this, but it is even more important, or even more apparent, that most of the aspects of mumbo jumbo that Gates wishes to connect to the Phaedros are precisely the aspects that are ultimately derived from Setna 1. So one could say that what Gates has really sensed, albeit indirectly, is a thematic resonance between the Phaedros and Setna 1. But Gates was not the first to make this connection. 20 years before Gates wrote, but I think unknown to Gates, because he certainly doesn't mention it, the French philosopher and literary critic Jacques Derrida had actually linked Setna 1 and the Phaedros more directly and more explicitly. Derrida came to Setna 1 no later than 1968 when he was preparing his essay La Pharmacie de Platon, or Plato's Pharmacy, a discussion of the Phaedros. Derrida did not attempt to integrate the tale into his main argument, but the connections he found in Setna 1 to Thoth and to esoteric knowledge inspired him to summarize part of the story in a lengthy footnote. I have the impression that Derrida wanted to work Setna 1 into his article mainly because he liked it, since he calls it étonnant, astonishing, and he'd actually gone so far as to compare various renderings and different editions of his source, Gaston Maspero's French anthology Les Contes Populaires de l'Égypte Ancienne, to try to work out some translational problems. Now, we don't have to believe in any sort of actual genetic or historic link between Setna 1 and the Phaedros to give both Gates and Derrida due credit for intuiting and pointing towards the theme of the mystical aspects of ancient Egypt's scribal tradition. Both Setna 1 and the Phaedros thematize the danger of writing and knowledge in the wrong hands, particularly if approached in the wrong way. For Derrida, the key to the Phaedros was the ambivalence of the word pharmakon, or drug, that Plato applies to the phenomenon of writing. In the Phaedros, Amun warns Thoth that simply to read a book for oneself will produce only the impression, quote, the impression, not the reality of wisdom. That is, when self-administered, the pharmakon of writing is a poison. For the pharmakon to be beneficial, a seeker of knowledge must always have recourse to a wise guide and personal initiation. The compilers, okay, skip that. But I think Ishmael Reed, on the other hand, or at least the authorial voice of Mumbo Jumbo, would not have agreed. In Mumbo Jumbo, the universal dissemination of the Book of Thoth, as I said, would result in the restoration of the true African religion and universal liberation. So, to conclude, for us, Zora Neale Hurston's Man of the Mountain is most interesting for the way in which it makes Setna 1 the intersection point for three important strands in African American thought of her day. First, the traditional African American discourse on Moses and his role and identity as liberator. Secondly, a cultural Pan-Africanism that looked for links between the traditions of disparate African peoples throughout the Americas, the Caribbean, and Africa itself. And third, a more specific Egyptocentrism. The Henri Gamache Mystery of the Long-Lost 8th, 9th, and 10th Books of Moses represents an attempt to actually use modern fiction to create a fake historical pedigree for the magical knowledge that the book was peddling. And finally, Ishmael Reed's Mumbo Jumbo takes for granted its readers' understanding of the role of Moses in the African-American conception of Egypt. But where Hurston wrote to provide an imaginative reconstruction of the history of tradition that is a sort of speculative anthropology, Reed wrote to undermine the traditional view of Moses, and to put the story in the service of a cultural and political agenda that was rooted in Afrocentrism, but was ultimately universal and broadly humanistic, to suggest that a return to authentic African tradition would be liberating not only for black people, but potentially for all people everywhere. The irony is that neither Gamache nor Reed realized, when writing their respective texts, just how authentic their African tale actually was. So, I thank you for your attention and look forward to discussion.